If you think about plants as not just something beautiful to look at and witness growing, but they're actually a fundamental biological benefit to that whole aquarium system. Hi everyone, and welcome to this guide to CO2 injection or carbon dioxide injection. And before we start, just a bit of context. I am going to be rescaping this Awase Scaper Line 60 very soon. Look out for a complete step-by-step tutorial video on that. Really excited to bring that one to you. And it's going to be fully planted, high tech, and of course CO2 injection. So I thought, rather than just fitting the CO2 kit, why not go through the whole thing with you guys, share my experiences with CO2, explain why it's beneficial, explain why you might not want to use it. And yeah, just a deep dive video on CO2 injection. Really excited for this one. If you watch it all the way to the end, like you did, many of you did, on the deep dive maintenance video on this Awase Highline 400, let me know in the comments. Really appreciate you guys watching it all the way to the end. So, CO2 injection, what is it? Well, for those that don't know, plants, their most important nutrient in order for them to grow is carbon, and they get most of their carbon from carbon dioxide. Now, background levels in aquarium water are generally very, very low. So in order to boost those background carbon dioxide levels, we add CO2 injection. Many ways to do this. The most popular and the most reliable and controllable way is via a pressurized CO2 kit. And that is what we're going to be installing on this Scaper Line 60 today. And I'll take you through the whole process. A little bit of theory for you. Plants need light and CO2 in order to grow. We call this photosynthesis. And it's a fascinating topic. We won't go into the kind of the formulas and all of the biochemistry behind it all, but it is a joyous process in my mind to experience, and we can actually visibly witness this process, not just through plant growth, but through this really beautiful phenomenon, you know what I mean, called pearling. Now this is when the plants are producing so much oxygen that the aquarium water becomes saturated with oxygen, so it cannot actually it's not able to have any more CO2 dissolved in that water. So what happens then is, as the plant's photosynthesizing, as it's producing more oxygen, there's nowhere for the oxygen to go. The aquarium water can't take any more in. So what happens is the plants actually start to produce gas bubbles. These are pure oxygen bubbles. And this is just such a joy to witness. This is the foundation of life on Earth. Oxygen is arguably the most important element for life on Earth, and we're visibly witnessing this in our aquariums. And I think that's such a privilege, such a luxury, and I think it's something that many of us don't really kind of think about. We take it for granted that we are, we're creators. We're creating these beautiful aquariums with these beautiful aquarium plants and these beautiful aquascapes. And we're rewarded with this beautiful process, visibly witnessing the creation of one of the fundamental building blocks to life on this planet. So next time you see your plants pearling, then just maybe have a think about what you're actually witnessing. It's really interesting, isn't it? I hope you find it interesting. I certainly do. We see pearling as, it's like something to aim for a lot of planted aquarium hobbyists. It's a sign that the plants are doing very well. And they only will start to pearl if you have enough light, enough CO2, enough other nutrients as well. So you'll need to be dosing probably a decent liquid fertilizer with a host of macro and micronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, iron, and a host of all the other micronutrients as well. And good circulation. These are the fundamental, in my mind, the principles behind a successful high energy planted tank. Good lighting, good CO2 injection, good circulation, lots of plants. You're only going to achieve pearling if there's enough plant growth earth plant biomass producing all of that oxygen to achieve that saturation, and then that will enable the pearling. So a bit of a ramble there about CO2 and pearling, etc., but hopefully you find it interesting. Let me know in the comments, do you see pearling in your aquariums? One of the kind of easiest way to kind of witness it and achieve it is actually when you're doing your water change. Next time you do a water change in your aquarium at home, even if you don't have CO2 injection in a few plants, what you can do, top tip, towards the end of your photo period, let's say you have your lights on for 8 hours, after sort of 6 or 7 hours or so maybe, change half of the water. So siphon out half of the water, and then hopefully you'll have some exposed plants to the air. Now what happens then, this is really cool, the plants will actually use the CO2 that's abundant in the air, and actually plants are adapted to be able to use CO2 in the air a lot easier than they can the CO2 in the water. So what's happening is as those plants are exposed to the air, they're really kind of soaking in that CO2, even if you don't have CO2 injection, of course, because they're getting the CO2 from the air. And then what happens is keep your lights on during this process, and then when you do your refill of fresh water, very often you'll see pearling, even if you don't have CO2 injection, because the plants, as I say, are using the CO2 from the air. So you can still witness this beautiful pearling process even without CO2 injection after your water changes. Do it at the end of the photo period, make sure your lights are on and those plants are exposed to the air for an amount of time to be able to get that CO2. Okay, so that's a bit of a kind of theory lesson on CO2 and the beauty of pearling. Why do we want to use CO2 injection? Why do we want to be able to grow plants better or faster? Well, actually, a lot of plants will actually really struggle without CO2 injection. So, for instance, if you go on the Tropica Aquarium Plants website, you'll notice that there's 3 categories of plants: easy, medium, and advanced. Let's think about advanced category plants. They will absolutely, almost definitely require CO2 injection to grow. Medium category will do much better with CO2 injection. Easy category don't need CO2, but all aquarium plants will absolutely benefit from CO2 injection. It will just give you a much better chance of success of plant growth. It will reward you with arguably richer colours, faster growth, which isn't necessarily a good thing if you don't want to maintain your plant so much. But the rewards are plentiful. You'll be able to grow a much wider variety of plants, have much more chance of success. You can get more compact growth, and it's just beneficial for the whole system, because what's happening is, if you think about plants as not just something beautiful to look at and witness growing, but they're actually a fundamental biological benefit to that whole aquarium system. They're producing oxygen, they're removing harmful toxins such as ammonia and nitrites and nitrates and other heavy metals. They're providing shelter and security for your fish, shrimp and snails. They look beautiful, of course, and they produce other kind of chemicals that will help produce algae growth. The faster and healthier the plant growth is, the less algae growth you get as well. So CO2 injection by default will improve the plant growth, which in turn then promotes the health of the overall planted aquarium system. So there's no downsides really to CO2 injection, apart from it is relatively expensive to buy a good quality kit. I recommend buying a high-end pressurized system with a twin stage regulator if possible. You can buy single stage regulators as well, but you do potentially get end of tank dump. So when the cylinder becomes towards the end of its life, it can suddenly discharge all of that CO2 in one go, which is a risk for some poorer quality single stage regulators. So try to get the best quality that you can. Talk about the brand I use in a minute. But yeah, downsides are it's quite expensive. It is dangerous. Excess CO2 is toxic to all life, including humans. So do treat it with respect. But if you follow the guidelines in this video, you should be fine. And what are the disadvantages? It does lower the pH of your water. So if you're keeping really hard water and high pH loving livestock, then CO2 might not be an option. But arguably, you probably wouldn't be growing plants in those sort of aquariums anyway. Most plants tend to prefer more neutral or lower pH There are exceptions like Vallisneria, a few other species that do really enjoy harder water. In fact, fun fact, they tend to get a lot of their carbon source from the bicarbonates in that hard water rather than the CO2. So I'm digressing again. But if you want to achieve the best chances of success with your aquarium plants, CO2 injection is the way to go. And in my mind, if you can afford it, go for a decent quality pressurized system, which is what we're using today. Okay, let's move on to the actual setting up. Well, let's go through the individual components to the CO2 kit in some detail, and then we'll talk about fitting it to the aquarium, and then finally how we test for CO2. Okay, let's talk about the entire CO2 system individually. We'll go through the individual components, how they work, and then eventually we'll actually fit it to the Scopoline 60. So we're using a refillable pressurized CO2 kit. So the first thing is a pressurized CO2 bottle. This is a 3 kilogram, which is around 6 pounds for our American friends. And this is refillable. I get my refills from my local aquarium shop, which is Aquarium Gardens. Costs me around 20 or 30 pounds per refill, which is about 30 or 40 US dollars. And it will last me, in this aquarium, will probably last me 6 months plus. So quite a cost-effective way to get your CO2 gas. It's very high pressure, so we're talking around 800 to 1000 psi, which is around 50 to 60 bar. So you have to treat it with respect. These cylinders do come with a valve here, which you open and close. I won't open it now because it will just squirt gas at the camera at a very high pressure. But needless to say, we're dealing with very high pressures, so do treat these with respect. Do store them vertically and not on their sides. You can use fire extinguishers. This is another popular method. The gas in the fire extinguishers is absolutely fine. This is just one way of getting your pressurized CO2 gas. You can use paintballing canisters, soda stream canisters. There's lots of other different ways, but in my mind, this is the most cost effective. Okay, next thing I'm going to talk about is the actual CO2 regulator. This is arguably the most important component in the entire CO2 system. It's going to be likely the most expensive part. It should be the most expensive part because it actually does the most important work. What it does, it reduces the dangerous high pressure from the cylinder. So if you remember 800 to 1000 psi or 50 to 60 bar, down to a safe working pressure, which is typically between 1 and 5 bar, depending on your system. That working pressure is important because you need enough to penetrate the ceramics of most diffusers. We'll talk about the diffusers in more detail, but the majority work with a ceramic material which is slightly porous to allow the CO2 microbubbles to penetrate. And depending on the material used, depends on how much pressure is required for that penetration. So typically the higher quality materials will require more pressure because the ceramic is much tighter and it will produce the smaller microbubbles, which are more efficient. They allow for more efficient diffusion in your aquarium water. If you think about a huge kind of bubble that's produced by like a regular air pump, those bubbles float straight to the surface and don't have much opportunity to diffuse in the water. But if you had a tiny, tiny microbubble, it stays in the water column for much longer, gives more contact time and allows for more CO2 diffusion. So we're really aiming for the smallest bubbles possible. I'm digressing into diffusers now, but hey ho. So this is a regulator. This is from my favourite CO2 regulator brand, Greenleaf Aquarium from the USA. Shout out to those guys who supply me with my GLA regulators. This is one of their smaller models. I have a larger model on my 400 here, and it's a dual stage, which means it has an adjustable working pressure here. You adjust the working pressure here, and then you adjust your actual bubble rate here. We'll talk about the bubble counter in a minute, but you have a needle valve here which adjusts the bubble rate. We have a solenoid as well here, so this is plugged into your power supply. We have here, it's a USB type. So when power is applied to the solenoid, it allows gas to come through the bubble counter and then into your CO2 diffuser. So we attach that to the cylinder. We fill up our bubble counter with some people use water. I actually use oil. I use a MCT oil, which I actually take in my coffee every morning. But the oil means that it doesn't actually escape or evaporate or whatever. It just actually stays in there forever, basically, whereas water tends to it will just eventually work its way through the CO2 tube and through the diffuser. So if you keep having to refill that with water, but with oil, it stays there. And I use a food grade oil, such as MCT oil, for that. So that's the CO2 regulator in a nutshell. You can pay anything from, I don't know, $100 to $300, or £100 to £300 or so, depending on the brand. Always opt for the more expensive if you can afford it, and definitely try to get the twin stage regulators. Without going into too much detail, they just give a more consistent CO2 output throughout the life of that cylinder. So that's the CO2 regulator in a nutshell. Solenoid, needle valve, bubble counter, and your working pressure dial here. And then we do have a contents gauge here, which also doubles up as the pressure gauge, so you can get an idea of the contents pressure. We'll fit that in a minute. Next thing I want to talk about is the actual diffuser. Now, I've got two here. This is the larger. This is for 16 millimeter, 16/22 millimeter hose, so an internal diameter of 16 millimeters, external 22. And then we have the smaller type here, 12 and 16 millimeter, which is fitted to these smaller hoses here. And then the bigger one here is fitted to the larger hoses on this aquarium here. I've got it out of its packet so we can actually see how it works. This is a special CO2 proof hosing, which is designed for CO2 use. CO2 is actually, gas is actually slightly acidic and can corrode regular kind of airline, so we tend to use a special CO2 proof hosing. That fits onto your CO2 inline diffuser. So this actually is fitted in line with your external canister filter output. So you'll have your return hose, that's the hose that pushes the water out of the filter. That fits in line with that hose. You simply cut square on that hose, fit one end, fit the other, and then your CO2 gas comes through your CO2 hose here, comes into the actual unit here, penetrates this white ceramic tube here, and then those tiny microbubbles, as it's penetrated through that ceramic tube, obviously flow then with your output of the water circulator and the water flow from your filter into your aquarium. And then the idea is those tiny microbubbles are firing all the way around your aquarium water. So this is an important learning point actually, so that you want to be aiming for fairly high levels of circulation generally in a higher energy planted aquarium. The more flow we have through here, of course, the more chance that CO2, those microbubbles, that CO2 gas, has of travelling all the way around the aquarium and therefore feeding all of those plants as equally as possible. If we say had a very slow flow rate through here, only a small portion potentially of those plants are going to receive that CO2 gas. So we want to be aiming for typically at least 5 to 10 times the aquarium's volume circulating per hour. So this, for instance, is a 20 gallon or say nearly 80 litre aquarium. So we want to be aiming for at least 400 to 800 litres per hour, or whatever that is in gallons. So 5 to 10 times the aquarium volume, times that by 5 or 10 times, and that's what your flow rate of your filter should be. This is fitted with an Oase Biomaster 600, which has a rated flow rate of around 1,000 litres per hour. After the pre-filter, etc., that's going to drop down quite a bit, so probably looking at 600, 800 litres per hour. So it's around about 10 times the volume circulating per hour, which is perfect. That I know then that CO2 is going to get distributed around that whole aquarium water column very effectively, thus feeding all the plants as equally as possible. If those plants aren't fed equally, some plants are really going to thrive. Those thriving plants are going to grab hold of more nutrients, they're going to grow much more vibrantly, and the plants that aren't getting so much CO2 are going to suffer. And you'll get this inequality of plant growth, and those poor plants you'll just see won't be growing so well, potentially get algae covered. Poorly plants tend to lead to algae issues. So by this point you should now be thinking, oh, CO2 and circulation, they're both very interdependent, and they're both, you need to really give some thought to circulation levels and circulating pattern as well. And that is determined by where you fit your filter outlet and inlets. That's going to have a huge impact on how that water is circulating around the aquarium. And that is something that you can test and adjust and just kind of keep an eye on. Hopefully what's happening is all of the plants in the aquarium are slightly kind of moving in that water circulation. And that means hopefully all the plants are getting access to that circulating CO2. That was a long monologue. I hope it all makes sense. We'll fit all the equipment now. I'll show you how I do that, and we're ready to kind of start injecting our CO2. I won't actually inject the CO2 on this system right now. This is for freshwater gobies. You can actually see the complete step-by-step vlog and a deep dive with my good friend Ty Streetman, who is author of Aquatic Habitats book. This is actually the last scape we ever set up for that book, so it's going to be sad to see it go. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with the fish. I'm not sure if they're really appropriate for in here, so I might take them back to the store. We'll have a think about that as I replace this scape with a new one. So let's fit the CO2 kit, and I'll show you exactly how I do that now. Okay, offer up our regulator to the cylinder. Here's the nut here, just align that, and then we can hopefully do it with our fingers to start with. Make sure you don't cross thread it. And then usually we want our bubble counter to be vertical. And then as it tightens, we can lock it off with I use an adjustable wrench. Before I should have done this earlier, let's take that off. You need to, it's a good learning point, you need to make sure there's a seal. Okay, here's one we've done earlier. Unfortunately, the regulator that I had does not have the seal present, so it was leaking. I lent the regulator to someone and they returned it without the seal. So if you're watching, you know who you are. Cheers for that. But it's no problem. I can just show you exactly the process on here. This is the GLA regulator that I've got fitted to my ORSA Highline 400. And I'll point out all the components and exactly what we do. So we fit the regulator to the cylinder here with this nut here. Make sure it's nice and tight so we don't have any leakage. Here is the contents gauge here. So we're on almost 800 psi, so it's starting to run out of gas. Then we have our working pressure here, which is about 4 bar, which is plenty enough to penetrate that ceramics, which we talked about earlier. And then we have our bubble counter, which is full of my MCT oil. And you can see there I'm running around 4 bubbles per second, which is plenty for this aquarium. Solenoid is here. I have the CO2 come on 1 hour before the lights, and it goes off with the lights. We have the CO2 come on an hour before the lights to allow the CO2 levels to build up. So as soon as the lights come on, those plants can begin photosynthesizing. So that's the CO2 fitted. Nice and simple. Lock it there, nice and tight. Turn on your CO2 cylinder here. You'll see your contents gauge go up to full if you have a full cylinder, of course. Adjust your working pressure here with the working pressure dial. I have it on 4 bar. And then you adjust your bubble rate here with the needle valve, and it goes on and off with the solenoid here, which I have on a separate timer to the lights. Hopefully that's nice and clear for you guys to understand. Here you can see the inline diffuser fitted. I have 2 Biomaster filters. This is fitted to one of the Biomaster here. This is the output, which we mentioned earlier. So filter water runs through here, picks up the microbubbles that have been come through this ceramic tube here, and then that gets fired into the aquarium. through the output nozzle on the rear left of the aquarium, and then those microbubbles feed all of the plants in the aquarium water. Okay, so unfortunately we couldn't fit the CO2 kit on this tank because I have that seal missing. It's like an O-ring that goes in between the regulator and the cylinder itself to provide a hermetic seal to avoid any gas leaking. Unfortunately that seal was missing, so couldn't use it on there for now. I will get a new seal, of course. Luckily I have one fitted here so I could talk through the process on this one. Hopefully it all made sense to you. I'll get some close-ups of the actual microbubbles floating around the tank so you can get an idea of how that actual CO2 is being distributed around the aquarium. That's the inline type of diffuser. There are the in-tank diffusers, which are very popular for smaller aquariums. So these are very similar principle. They have a ceramic disc, but the disc situated inside the tank and the CO2 bubbles come out of that rather than inline. I prefer inline diffusers because they keep the equipment out of the tank, and in my mind they have a better opportunity to get that CO2 gas around the whole aquarium because it's fitted in line with the filter. That's CO2 injection and the injection kit fitment procedure in a nutshell. I keep saying in a nutshell, interesting. CO2 testing is quite a complex topic. The very popular method is the CO2 drop checker method. I have a video on that, I'll leave a link to that in the description, and I also cover the old school method of the CO2 table where you can measure KH and pH, and there is also the pH drop of 1 method which I cover in my aquascaping book. Basically you test the water without any CO2 injection present, the pH, test that pH, let's say it's 7.5, then you inject your CO2, and once you've reached your maximum level of CO2 in the water, you test your pH again, and it ideally should be exactly a pH of 1 less. So if you did have 7.5, you're aiming for 6.5, and that gives you a CO2 level of around 30 parts per million, which is what most of us are aiming for when we're using CO2 injection. Much more than 30 parts per million, and you're looking at making that CO2 potentially toxic for your livestock, and much less than that and you're not really getting the benefit so much. So you're looking around, ideally 20 to 30 parts per million. You can use more CO2 than that if you have higher levels of oxygen. This is getting into quite complex territory now, but roughly speaking you want to be aiming for a CO2 level of 30 parts per million. If you're using a CO2 drop checker, that's like a lime green colour, and you can use the 1 drop pH, the pH of 1 drop method, and you have the old school CO2 chart method as well. I'm going to close it there, guys. Thanks for watching all the way to the end if you did. Really appreciate it. I'm going away for a weekend to see my old mate Ray. Some of you may remember Ray from Scape Nature, which is now under new ownership. But Ray lives over in Northern Ireland, so my beautiful wife are going over for a lovely weekend to see those guys over there. So see you next week, hopefully. I really enjoy making these long form, kind of deeper dive videos for you, if and when I get the time, in between editing photos for the Aquatic Habitats book. Take care, see you on the next one. Cheerio. Hi everyone, and welcome to this complete practical guide and a bit of theory as well to CO2 injection, CO2 carbon dioxide of course. Before I go through what we're going to do, let's make sure the video's working and make sure the audio and everything's in focus. Oh dear.